Dig a hole 6 feet deep anywhere in Dakota Territory in January, when the surface temperature reads 40 below. Put your hand to the dirt at the bottom of that hole, and it will be 50 degrees, maybe 52, and it does not fluctuate and it does not freeze. 6 feet of earth sits above it, and the atmosphere howls and the cattle die standing up in the fields, and 6 feet down the temperature has barely moved since August. Nora Voss knew that before she knew what to call it, and that single piece of knowledge is why she was the only person in a 6-mile radius of Kingsbury County, Dakota Territory, who was not burning furniture in January of 1888, while the neighbours who had spent the autumn laughing at her were now burning chair legs. The grasslands of Kingsbury County had already gone brown by October of 1887, the kind of flat, colourless brown that told you the season was finished with preliminaries, and Nora Voss was 29 years old, a widow of 7 months, and she had $4.83 to her name. Her husband Carl had died in March. A horse spooked on the ice crossing the James River. The wagon went in, and that was the end of it. He had been 31, and they had filed on 160 acres the previous spring, under the Homestead Act. So the quarter section was hers now. The debt was hers, and so was the problem of the coming winter. The firewood was gone. Carl had ordered a load of cottonwood from a dealer in Huron. Cottonwood burns fast and throws some heat. Not much, but it was what you could get. And the dealer had delivered half of it in September and taken the remainder payment up front, and then promptly moved his operations south to Pierre, leaving Nora with 11 days' worth of wood if she burned it carefully, and no recourse under any law she could enforce alone. The nearest neighbour of any use was Peder Dahl, a Norwegian-born wheat farmer who had arrived on the Burlington Railroad 3 springs before with his wife Britt and a hired man named Gustafson. Peder was not a cruel man, not a man who wished Nora Voss harm, but he was a man with absolute confidence in the way things were done, which is often more dangerous than cruelty. When Nora walked the half-mile to the Dahl place in the 2nd week of October to ask about purchasing any excess firewood, Peder listened with the particular patience of a man who has already decided the answer before the question is finished. His woodpile ran north from the barn wall, cottonwood and some elm, stacked 6 feet high and 18 feet long, and he told her he had none to spare. He looked at her property, the shallow south-facing bank she had dug into that past summer, the structure that looked from the outside like nothing more than a mound of earth with a door set into it. And he said something she did not forget. "A hole in the ground won't hold heat. You'll freeze in there before Christmas." She thanked him and walked home. What Nora had built that summer was not a hole in the ground, but a dugout, and not the accidental, desperate kind that newly arrived settlers scratched into creek banks with whatever tools they had. She had been deliberate about every decision. The bank she chose faced south, and that was the first decision and the most important one, though she would not have explained it in those terms. She had grown up in a sod house in Minnesota with her parents and had noticed something her father never commented on. The south-facing rooms were warmer. The sun in January sits low on the horizon at Kingsbury County's latitude of roughly 44 degrees north. The noon sun in December barely clears 22 degrees above the horizon, and that low angle means sunlight hits a south-facing wall nearly straight on, the way a hand presses flat against a surface, while a north-facing wall gets almost nothing. Nora's south-facing bank received that low winter sun for the full middle hours of the day, and she had done something none of her neighbours had done. She had set glass in the south wall, 2 panes, each 8 inches by 10 inches, purchased from the Montgomery Ward catalogue for 11 cents apiece, and carried from Huron wrapped in her coat. 16 cents of glass total. The neighbours thought it foolish glass broke in freight wagons. Glass was money wasted on a house that was already a joke, and Peder Dahl's wife Britt had remarked at the church meeting in August that Nora was spending money on windows for a burrow. Those 2 panes of glass changed everything about how the structure performed, and the reason comes down to a straightforward comparison. Oiled paper which most dugout settlers used when they could not afford glass, transmits roughly 40% of the solar energy that hits it, while glass transmits 86%. The difference on a clear January afternoon with the sun at that low angle was the difference between a gesture of warmth and actual warmth. On a sunny day at 20 degrees below zero outside, those two south-facing glass panes delivered enough solar energy to raise the interior temperature by 8 to 12 degrees without any fire at all, and in a space already partially insulated by the earth itself, those degrees mattered enormously. The dugout measured 14 feet deep into the bank and 12 feet wide. Nora had dug it herself over 6 weeks in July and August, starting before sunrise most mornings and stopping when the heat made it impossible to work. The walls were the bank itself, packed earth and clay 3 feet thick on 3 sides, and on the 4th side, the south-facing front wall, sod blocks she had cut and stacked to 2 feet thick. The roof was cottonwood poles laid across the width, then a foot of brush, then 18 inches of sod on top, and the total earth covering 3 feet on the sides, 2 feet on the front, 18 inches on the roof, created a thermal shell that the cold had to work through from every direction before it could reach the interior air. At 4 feet below grade, the earth temperature in January in Kingsbury County stays between 45 and 50 degrees, which means the walls of Nora's dugout were not losing heat to air at 40 below zero, but to earth at 48 degrees. Heat flows from warm to cold, and the larger the temperature difference, the faster it flows, so a wall losing heat to 48-degree earth loses it about 11 times more slowly than a wall losing heat to 40 below zero air. That is what Peter Dahl could not see when he looked at the mound of earth with a door in it and concluded it was a poor woman's inadequate shelter. What it actually was, built the way Nora built it, was a structure whose walls were never in contact with the Dakota winter at all. The door she had set on the east side of the south face, slightly recessed into the bank, and the firewood problem was real 11 days' worth in early October. 5 months to get through, but Nora had already been solving that problem since July, and not with firewood. The open-range cattle operations of the late 1880s left the prairie covered in dried manure, and settlers had been burning it for fuel since the 1860s, so it was not a secret or an innovation. What Nora had done was be more systematic about it than anyone else in the area. Through August and September, she gathered and stacked dried chips into a pile that ran along the north exterior wall of the dugout, 7 feet high and 22 feet long, and her neighbours had laughed at that too. Gustafson, the Dahl's hired man, had called it her dung palace when he passed on the road. Dried cow chips burn at 4,000 to 7,000 BTU per pound, depending on moisture content and what the cattle had been grazing, and seasoned cottonwood hardwood runs 6,000 to 8,000 BTU per pound, so the chips were not enormously inferior to wood as a heat source, and there were thousands of them, free, within half a mile in any direction. At 20 degrees below zero, holding 60 degrees inside the dugout required losing roughly 90,000 BTU per day through the walls and roof, and a cast-iron stove burning dried chips at reasonable efficiency could produce that from about 30 to 40 pounds of chips, a manageable daily haul from a pile that, by Nora's estimate, weighed close to 3 tons. She also had the sun doing part of the work at no cost. On a clear January day, and Kingsbury County averaged about 55% of possible sunshine hours in winter, those 2 glass panes and the south-facing wall, they sat in absorbed solar radiation for 5 or 6 hours, and the sod blocks of the front wall, 2 feet thick and dense with clay, acted as a slow-release thermal store. Dense materials absorb heat slowly and release it slowly, and the sod's heat capacity meant that by 3 in the afternoon, the front wall was actually warmer than the interior air, and radiated that warmth back into the space for hours after the sun went down. The chips in the stove handled the nights and the cloudy days. The sun handled whatever it could, and the earth handled everything the stove and the sun could not reach. Nora's calculation, worked out on paper over a summer of measuring and estimating, was that she needed roughly 600 pounds of chips per month for the coldest months, and she had over 5,000 pounds stacked and drying by October 1st. The community in Kingsbury County that fall was not cruel to Nora Voss, so much as it was certain that a widow without a man to cut wood was not going to survive a plains winter, certain that a dugout was a temporary measure that decent people graduated out of as soon as they could manage a frame house, certain that burning cow manure was what you did when you had run out of options and not what you planned for in July. That certainty had a spokesperson in Verna Foss, no relation to Nora. The name was common enough among Norwegian-descended settlers who ran the grain elevator in the small settlement of Badger Creek, 3 miles northeast. Verna was 53, had been in Dakota Territory since 1880, and had survived 2 serious winters in a proper frame house with a good iron stove and more wood than he needed, and he was the man people asked about surviving winter. He visited Nora's claim in mid-October, ostensibly to discuss whether she planned to sell the land, walked around the outside of the dugout, looked at the stacked chips, looked at the 2 glass panes in the south wall, and delivered his verdict with the gentleness of a man who believed he was being kind. "You're going to need to make arrangements," he said. "With a family in town, maybe. A widow alone out here with no wood when January comes, that stove won't save you. You'll wake up one morning and not wake up at all." He was not wrong that cold kills people in their sleep. Settlers had died that way, and the threat was real, but what he could not see, because he had never thought about the physics of the earth his frame house sat on top of, was that Nora was not relying on the stove alone. She thanked him and did not discuss the arrangement he suggested. By November, the neighbours had mostly stopped coming by. The days were short, and there was no visible reason to visit a woman who had made her choices, and her dugout sat into the bank with snow beginning to drift across the north side of the roof, easy to miss from the road entirely, which was partly the point. A structure that the wind passed over rather than hit was one that did not shed heat into the air. The wind was carrying away. January 12th, 1888 arrived without adequate warning. The morning broke at 41 degrees above zero, and children across Dakota Territory and Nebraska walked to school without coats buttoned, and farmers who had been careful all December relaxed, the stretch of warm air after weeks of cold feeling like something given back. The wall of cold hit mid-morning, and in the next 3 minutes the temperature dropped 18 degrees. And within the hour, it had fallen below zero, and the sky turned the particular bruised yellow-grey that old settlers recognized but hadn't seen in years. By noon, the wind was driving at 40 to 50 miles an hour, and the snow was moving horizontally, and visibility was gone, not reduced, but gone. People who stepped outside to reach their barns 20 yards away could not find them. Minnie Freeman, a 19-year-old schoolteacher near Ord in Nebraska, tied her 13 students together with twine and walked them through the blinding snow to a farmhouse, unable to see her hand in front of her face. In Kingsbury County, the temperature hit -36 by nightfall, -41 by the following morning, and the storm did not leave for 3 days. At the Dahl farm, the frame house with its pine plank walls and adequate iron stove went through the first night. Normally enough, Peter fed the stove, and the interior held perhaps 50 degrees, which was cold but survivable. But on the second night, the woodpile was running at a rate he hadn't calculated for, because the house was losing heat faster than expected. A frame house with pine plank walls, no insulation, and single-pane glass on 3 sides loses heat to 40 below air at a rate that demands constant fuel, because the inside and outside surfaces of those pine walls are in direct contact with the full temperature difference. No earth buffer, no thermal mass, and when the outside is 40 below, the wall itself runs nearly that cold, and the stove has to fight the entire gap between 40 below and 50 degrees every hour all night. By the second morning, Pedder was burning furniture, not because he was lazy or unprepared, but because the physics of his house demanded more than he had. The Gustafson hired man had a room in the barn and was burning what straw he could get to, and Britt Dahl had piled every blanket they owned onto the bed, and the children were wearing their coats inside the house. At Werner Voss's place in Badger Creek, the situation was similar. He had planned for a normal winter, and the winter of 1888 was not a normal winter. His wood ran out on day 2, and by day 3 he was burning the floorboards of a storage shed. Nora's dugout had not changed significantly. The earth walls had not changed temperature at all, still in contact with earth sitting between 45 and 50 degrees. Regardless of what was happening at the surface, and the 18 inches of sod on the roof had a foot of drifted snow on top of it by the end of day 1, and that snow, with an R value of roughly 1 per inch comparable to fiberglass batting, added another R12 of insulation above the sod. The structure was better insulated during the blizzard than it had been in November. Wind that hit the banked earth of the north and east sides moved around and over without finding a flat wall to strip heat from, and the 2 glass panes on the south face were covered by drifted snow during the storm itself. So there was no solar gain during those 3 days, but there was also no significant heat loss through the snow-covered glass, because snow insulates in both directions. On day 1 of the storm, Nora burned about 40 pounds of chips. On day 235, and the interior held between 53 and 58 degrees without extraordinary effort. She had 2 milk cows in the back section of the dugout, not ideal living arrangements, but each cow generates somewhere between 500 and 1500 BTU per hour of body heat, and 2 cows in a sealed space contribute real warmth. She slept. She was not comfortable. The temperature in the earth floor was cold, and the smell of 2 cows in an enclosed space is a significant smell, but she was not in danger. On the 3rd day, the wind dropped enough for a person to navigate the distance between farms, and Pedder Dahl arrived in mid-morning and knocked on the door set into the south bank, and when Nora opened it, the interior temperature had him removing his coat within a minute. He did not explain himself. He asked if she had room for Britt and the children while the storm finished. She said yes, and he went back and returned with them in an hour. Werner Voss came the following day with his wife and their hired man, frostbite on 2 fingers from the walk from the road to the door, even with the weather moderating, and he stood in the dugout and looked at the coal oil lamp, and the stove running at barely half capacity, and the temperature that required no coat, and he was quiet for a long time before he said, "The earth. You're using the earth." Nora told him the earth had been here longer than the weather, and had had time to make up its mind about temperature. The Schoolchildren's blizzard of the 12th of January 1888 killed at least 235 people across Dakota Territory and Nebraska, probably more. The final count was disputed for years, as some deaths weren't recorded until spring thaw, and most of them died in frame houses and barns with failed heating or in the open, caught between buildings with no visibility, with children in several schools freezing to death when teachers led them outside, and became disoriented within yards of the schoolhouse door. In Kingsbury County specifically, 3 cattle operations lost between 60 and 90% of their herds. Livestock in open air or poorly insulated barns froze overnight, and Nora's 2 milk cows both survived. She filed her final homestead claim in April of 1888, 5 years after Carl had filed, and it transferred to her on proof of continuous occupation she had occupied continuously, and the county land records for Kingsbury County, Dakota Territory, include Nora Voss among the claimants who proved up in the spring of 1888. What Nora built is not exotic technology, and the physics behind it is the same physics that the Mandan people of the Missouri River had been using for 400 years before any white settler arrived in Dakota Territory. Their earth lodges were semi-subterranean structures 12 to 24 inches below grade, with earth walls several feet thick and entry tunnels 6 to 15 feet long that acted as airlocks between the cold outside and the warm inside. And George Catlin visited Mandan villages in the 1830s and wrote that the lodges were perfectly warm even when outside temperatures fell to 40 below zero. The settlers who arrived in the 1870s and 1880s mostly knew this in a general way. They knew the Mandan built into the earth and survived, but what many of them did not believe applied to their own situation was why it worked. They thought it was a primitive solution, something you did before you could afford to build a real house. But the real house, the frame house with thin pine walls and a window on every side, was actually the worst thermal design because it had no earth contact, no thermal mass, and every wall exposed to the full temperature difference between inside and outside air. An earth-sheltered dugout built into a south-facing bank with earth contact walls on 3 sides and a solar-gaining south face lost heat at roughly 40% the rate of a comparable freestanding structure and needed 40% as much fuel, and in a winter when standard fuel supplies failed, a 40% was the difference between surviving and not. The principle Nora used, without naming it, that Earth below a certain depth maintains a near constant temperature, regardless of surface conditions, was not formally documented for the Great Plains until the North Dakota. Geological Survey studied it decades later with the consistent finding that below 4 to 6 feet, ground temperature in the Dakotas and Nebraska stays between 45 and 55 degrees year-round, drawing steady warmth from geothermal energy working its way up from far below, a temperature that does not change with the weather, does not freeze, and does not respond to a blizzard, existing whether or not anyone is using it. The second principle, that dense material stores heat and releases it slowly, is why Mandan lodges worked, why the sod front wall Nora built worked, and why every earth construction tradition in cold climates converged on thick, dense walls rather than thin ones. A 2-foot sod wall properly packed absorbs heat during the sunny hours and radiates it back during the dark hours, because the heat does not disappear when the sun goes down, but moves through the wall slowly, emerging on the interior side 4 to 8 hours later, depending on thickness. Nora was running a slow-release heating system off sunlight she collected in the afternoon and delivered to the interior through the night. The aerodynamics also mattered, though this is harder to see. A flat-walled frame house on open Dakota prairie is a direct obstacle to 40-mile-an-hour wind, which hits the wall, is forced to stop, and transfers an enormous amount of energy into that wall before moving around it, and that energy transfer strips heat. While a structure built into a hillside offers no flat wall to the prevailing northwest wind, because the hill itself redirects wind over and around the dugout, with the structure sitting in the sheltered zone on the lee side, where wind speed drops to 20 to 30% of open field speed. The difference in heat loss between a structure hit by 40-mile-an-hour wind and the same structure in 10-mile-an-hour wind is not a small number. It is the difference between a stove that keeps pace and one that cannot. After the storm, Nora Voss rebuilt his storage shed, dug partially into the side of the small rise behind his property, with a south-facing door and a chip storage area on the north side, and he called it his winter storage rather than an earth lodge or a dugout, and he mentioned Nora Voss's name when he described it to other settlers, not with enthusiasm, but with the particular tone of a man giving credit he would rather not give. Pederdal was more direct and told his neighbour Ole Bernson exactly what had happened, and Ole told his brother-in-law, and within 2 seasons the practice of orienting new dugouts to south-facing banks was something settlers in that part of Kingsbury County actually followed. having previously ignored advice that had always been in the homestead guides. Britt Dahl's eldest daughter, who was 9 during the blizzard and spent 3 days in Nora's dugout, eating flatbread and listening to the wind move over the hill above, grew up and built her own homestead claim in Spink County with the house oriented into the south face of a ridge, noting in her diary that she had done it the way Mrs. Voss had done, because it works. None of what happened in January 1,888 inches Kingsbury County was unusual as history. Women homesteaded alone, in significant numbers. The National Park Service estimates single women filed 10 to 12% of all homestead claims in certain territories, and as high as 18% in some Dakota counties. And they proved up at a higher rate than men, which ran directly against the conventional assumption that a woman alone on the frontier was necessarily helpless. The firewood shortage Nora faced was not unusual either, because cottonwood burned fast and was never abundant enough. Coal was available near rail lines, but not everywhere, and the treeless plains forced people to rethink fuel entirely, with the settlers who survived the worst winters being the ones who had stacked more chips, burned twisted hay carefully, and reduced their heating demand rather than tried to outpace it with fuel they could not afford. Reducing heating demand is what Nora had actually done. The neighbours saw a woman who appeared to be using less fuel and assumed she was cold, but what she had done was build a structure that needed less fuel to stay warm. And a house that needs 30 pounds of chips to hold 55 degrees in a 40 below blizzard is not suffering from a fuel shortage, while a house that needs 120 pounds to hold 40 degrees in the same conditions is in real trouble regardless of how large the woodpile is. The technology that kept Nora warm in January of 1888 is not obsolete. Passive house construction, a formal building standard now used in Europe and increasingly in North America, is built on exactly the same principles: massive insulation, thermal mass, south-facing glazing, and elimination of pathways where heat escapes through the structure. The standard requires so little heating energy that a well-built passive house can be warmed almost entirely by body heat, solar gain, and the heat generated by cooking and appliances, with a small backup heater for the coldest periods. The Mandan earth lodges of the Missouri River Valley used those principles without a building code or an engineering degree, and Nora Voss used them without an engineering degree or a name for what she was doing. And Werner Voss came around to them after his floorboards were ash. The last clear fact about Nora Voss from the historical record: she was still farming the Kingsbury County claim in the summer of 1892, 5 years after Carl's death, with the land records confirming it, and a county agricultural survey from that year, listing her among active homesteaders in the district, with 16 cultivated acres, 2 milk cows, and a permanent earth construction dwelling oriented to the south slope. Peder Dahl's frame house, which he had spent $400 building and had been so certain was the correct approach, burned to the ground. In the summer of 1891, when a grass fire moved through the district, frame houses on the prairie burned. Nora's earth construction did not. The earth, as she had said, had made up its mind about temperature, and it had made up its mind about fire as well. Share project content she. Niche created by you she. Avoid these styles. These styles were used. Text 133 line STT.